Good evening, everyone. Hope you can hear me all right. I'm Isabelle Pelly, and I'm CaLP's technical coordinator. And it's a privilege to be chairing this panel tonight on the future of cash as part of CaLP's broader week of events, which we've been calling Cash Week, and which we've had the privilege of having many of you involved in. So this evening's panel will really draw on the discussions we've been having over the course of the week and try to build on the collective capacity and insight we've got in the room to consider what future scenarios are for those of us involved in cash assistance and what the implications are for each of you and your organisations. So as a starting point, I'm going to challenge us to change our vocabulary a little bit. And use the term financial assistance as much as we can rather than cash assistance. And the reason for that is because if we're looking into the future, we should be looking beyond what we narrowly define as humanitarian cash assistance today and understand how people's financial needs can be met through a range of different means. And I think using this term of financial assistance is a strong starting point for us to really broaden our thinking and explore all the sort of possible futures ahead of us and think beyond our current ways of working. So I'll now briefly introduce this evening's panelists before framing the discussion, and then you'll be hearing from them. So to my right, we have Christina Bennett, who's the head of the Humanitarian Policy Group here at ODI. And this evening, we're lucky to benefit from her substantial work on the futures of humanitarianism, in particular the Time to Let Go report, and also a recent podcast series called Constructive Deconstruction, which I very much recommend, as she reflects on the implications of this body of work for financial assistance. Paula Gil Baizan is an independent consultant specialized in foresight and behavioral insights for humanitarian aid. Paula has worked with a broad range of organisations to support their strategic planning on cash, and that includes both NGOs and the private sector, and help them project themselves into the future. And so she'll be sharing some of those insights with us tonight. Rahul is the Executive Director for the Global Alliance for Humanitarian Innovation. GAHI worked to scale innovation in the humanitarian system by focusing on the misalignment of resources, interests, and incentives that limit change. So he'll be sharing some of those insights and helping us shine a mirror to some of the barriers that may prevent us from exploring different futures. And Paul Currion is the COO at Disberse, which is a new type of financial institution that drives the transparent, efficient, and effective flow of development and humanitarian aid. And so obviously that has big implications for the future of financial assistance as well. Paul has also written extensively on the future of humanitarianism, and he was also involved in the podcast series that I just mentioned. So just to frame the discussion a little bit, I'd like to start by framing it in terms of some of the recent debates on cash assistance. And I think a few themes really stand out from some of the discussions that many of us in this room have been having. Firstly, the need for innovation in terms of our ways of working, but of course also in terms of the technologies that are open and available to us, and integration within systems, between each other. And these are very strong themes that came out from CaLP's State of the World's Cash report. Also, the importance of focusing on value for people over value for money. And this is a really strong theme coming out from the cash conference organised by the British Red Cross just a few weeks ago. And across these themes, I think the clear underlying message is that cash challenges us to make fundamental changes to the ways in which we work. And actually, that's a far more important innovation than many of the technological opportunities that surround us. So, arguably, this discourse around change has been around for a while, but do we really know what those changes could and should look like and what that means for each of our roles? I think that's a core question for us this evening. So our panellists will remind us how urgent this reflection is because of a broad range of changes that are ongoing within the humanitarian system more broadly, or that will impact the humanitarian system more broadly, whether that's shifts in global governance, the roles of networks, megacities, and how that influences governance structures, changing humanitarian contexts, but also a growing gap between needs and resources. And these are some of the themes that Christina will touch on in particular. So you may ask, why is CaLP hosting this discussion? I think there's a couple of reasons. So firstly, cash exposes flaws that have been embedded in the humanitarian system for many years and provides an opportunity to address them. And this is verbatim, actually, from the British Red Cross Cash Conference report. So we know this, so what are we going to do about this? Another reason is that we've heard strong demand from our members. So CaLP now has 80-plus members, and many of them have asked us to work with them to analyse and shape the future of cash assistance. So that's why CaLP has decided to launch a process to envision what the future of financial assistance could look like, with and for the benefit of our members. And by using this broader lens of financial assistance that I'm encouraging us to use, it forces us to look beyond the confines of our current humanitarian system and explore trends in various financial instruments, partnerships, and technology, anything from social safety nets to financial inclusion to remittances, universal basic income, peer-to-peer giving, just to name a few, and the implications of them for the future. So the process that we're proposing to lead is really grounded in futures thinking, and thinking on why does humanitarian system change. And we want to work with you all to analyse the trends and drivers of change and what they mean for our collective futures. And we hope that by going through this process, we can identify changes that are clearer, more intentional, and also crucially oriented towards optimising outcomes for people affected by crises. So this panel is part of this process, and as I say, it's only in its infancy, and we really want to shape it with you all. And we'll be delving into more depth tomorrow with some of our NGO members, and in many other forums as we go forwards. So I'm going to kick off the discussion by asking our panelists to answer in 1 minute only their vision for how financial assistance will be delivered by 2030. And I'm going to start with Christina, please.
Okay, my 1 minute pitch. You ready?
Yeah.
I've got 5 points for you. And then I'll talk about them a little bit in more detail later. Okay, how will financial assistance be delivered in 2030? It will be delivered through networks, not institutions. It will be delivered around problems and not based on mandates. Or it will be focused on individuals and communities equally. It will be channeled to needs and vulnerabilities, as it is today, but it'll also lay the foundation to be channeled through to opportunities, and especially in protracted crises. And it will equally focus on funding, so the concessional grants that we have today, and financing. And I think that's a point you've made already. That's my pitch.
Excellent. Can't wait to hear more. Paula, over to you. 1 minute pitch.
Right. So my hope, it's not my prediction, it's my hope, that if we look at cash from the point of view of people, it will look more digital, more reliable, more mobile, more frictionless. Now, my forecast from the point of view of the agencies is that it's going to look more unequal. It's going to look more digital in places that we don't do cash in, like California. It's going to look more advanced and technologically savvy in middle-income countries, and it's going to look very, very low-tech in fragility, where there's no connectivity and where there's really like no other resources to do cash.
Thanks, Paula. Rahul?
So the best piece of future thinking that I know of is the IPCC. And if we don't have serious, substantial collective transformation of the economy, the best piece of advice I can give you for what assistance looks like comes from an art project where a young man lived on a mountainside as a goat for 3 days. If you're going to look to the future and we don't have change, that's what you're going to need to learn from. Assuming we solve the climate problem, I think you will see international assistance focused only and exclusively on the last mile, the most complex and chronic sources of poverty and conflict. I think you will see regional and national architectures solving their own problems at larger levels, and the occasional global catastrophe relying on some sort of global cash delivery mechanism to solve its problems.
Paul, how about you?
The rise of cash assistance or financial assistance in the humanitarian sector is a broader reflection not of the desire for change within the sector, but actually the appearance of new technologies which make delivering financial assistance at scale possible. Those technologies are digital. They're part of the networked revolution that the entire world is basically going through, although at different levels at different times. Now, the problem with that, from our perspective, is that although digital looks more reliable, it looks more convenient. These are things that we're told by the companies that are selling us products. They also increase the risk to people. There are a large number of unforeseen risks that come out of the digitization of cash and our embrace of that digitization without necessarily understanding what those risks are. Now, in the world of information security, there's a concept known as the attack surface, and it's the vulnerable and exposed surface of a piece of software, essentially, that a hacker could get at. What we are essentially doing is increasing the attack surface of the most vulnerable people in the world, and we haven't even thought about it.
Terrifying. Well, thank you all for whetting our appetites, and now looking forward to hearing more from you. So back to you, Christina.
Okay, great, thanks. As Isabelle said at the start of this, what we've been working on here at HPG, at the Overseas Development Institute, is looking at the future of humanitarian action. And the way we did that is we wrote that Time to Let Go report ahead of the World Humanitarian Summit, which was really about diagnosing the problem. What do we see are the things that are at the heart of the problem of the humanitarian system, that despite all of the ingenuity and the good sense and the passion and the compassion of individuals and organizations working in this system, the system itself holds all of that back. So what do we do about it? The second part of our research was called constructive deconstruction, where we sought to sort of take those problems, sort of disaggregate them within the system, deconstruct the system itself, and then almost rebuild it as if you were to start from scratch. That was a bit of a minefield in terms of trying to come up with alternative ways of imagining humanitarian action, but we did come up with some sort of interesting observations as a result of deconstructing the system that we have. So what I'm about to say is the result of all of that thinking that we've done, and many of the people on this panel and some of you in the room were also involved in that, so thanks to all of that. In terms of the diagnosis of the financing problem, I mean, I think we feel very strongly that it's not about not having enough money, that kind of broke versus broken conversation. We do have the money. It's about the fact that we don't use it effectively, and we don't apply it to the things that should matter to us most. So, and as I said earlier, it's not due to the lack of hard work or compassion or of particular individuals. It's really about the system not allowing us to spend money in the way that we should be, given the resources that we have. Why is that? Why does the system hold us back? Well, we came up with sort of a set of pathologies that really sit at the heart of the system and that really prevent us from working in the way that we want to. And I'll just run through 4 of these pathologies that have to do specifically with financing. One is this idea of destructive competition. We work in a system where we have a small, limited number of funders funding a very fragmented set of recipients, so organizations, who are all competing for the same pot of money to do the same exact type of work. What that does is it means that it sort of it pits us against each other. It it creates strong disincentives to work together and to stay in our silos. So despite all of this talk about collective outcomes and new ways of working and all of that business, we are incentivized to work against one another despite our good intentions. Second, a lack of diversity in funding. It holds most of our operations hostage to the political interests and whims of the people that fund us. And it also biases us against preventative action, that it's very hard to get funders interested in averting a crisis when they can get much more political leverage and mileage out of one that is saved. And that whole kind of savior narrative really drives the political interests of the way, really drives the way that we are funded as organizations and our projects. Third, that we are a supply-based service delivery system. And I'm seeing lots of nodding of heads because I think none of this is new to any of you. That puts the power in the hands of those who have something to give, and it often means that what is received on the ground isn't actually what's wanted. And fourth, an inherent sort of humanitarian exceptionalism. This is somewhat based on humanitarian principles and the fact that humanitarian principles sort of set us apart from other forms of aid. It's also based on the fact that we have very different ways of working from, for example, our development counterparts. But what that does is it creates that distance between us and other forms of aid and almost suggests that other types of relief are, because they're not humanitarian, and I put that in quotation marks, aren't legitimate forms of relief, when actually they could be helping us to fill those gaps that we find ourselves facing every day. So if those are the problems, if those are the pathologies at the heart of the sector, what does this mean for finance? What do we need to do to be able to unlock those pathologies? Number one, finance needs to be more preventative. We need to have better independent funding mechanisms that are divorced from the political agendas of the donors and focused on prevention and mitigating risks. This includes diversifying our funding portfolios, really looking into alternative sources of funding, and a greater focus on tools that allow us to anticipate crises and fund that anticipation, and fund response to crises before they happen, or fund those risks. The second is funding needs to be more predictable, and that's just more than just multi-year financing. It really means looking at new ways of not only funding short-term projects or multi-year projects, but really engaging those who can be more predictable funders. Private sector funders, for example, often operate on much longer timeframes than grant-making institutions right now. We don't focus on the private sector for a lot of reasons on creating those more sustainable solutions in the places where we work. Third, finance needs to be more problem-based. We fund now based on mandates, based on supply, based on the projects that we put into appeals. We don't fund for collective action. We don't fund for problem solving, and maybe we should. And finally, the shifting from a reliance on funding to really considering financing. And what do I mean by that? Now we operate off of concessional grants. And it's money that goes out from a donor and into a project or an organization, and it stays there. There is nothing that grows that money. There is nothing that leverages that money to create additional funds. And can we be thinking much more about financing as a way of investing in the future of humanitarian action, as a way of investing in the future of the communities that we are seeking to help? So, given all of what I've just said, what does the next generation of cash assistance look like? I think we can all agree that cash has been a really effective financial disruptor. But from my view, and based on what I just said, it's still largely operating with the same institutions and the same ways of working, just sort of creating a new mechanism and new channels, but to do the same type of work in the same way that we've always done it. So in my mind, the next generation of cash assistance needs to see humanitarian aid in an entirely new way. What does that mean? Well, shift of cash assistance from the institution to the network. Through funding of networks, cash assistance can create funders and individuals much more directly, bypassing traditional institutions, broadening the range of sources of funds beyond traditional donors, and enabling things like crowdfunding, channeling remittances, all money that comes into crisis context, but not that we take advantage of ourselves. Second, the shift of cash needs to be from the individual to the collective. For example, what about instead of funding programs in an individual crisis context, we gave out community cash block grants. So you would put a lump of cash at the disposal of the community for the community to be able to implement the priorities that they see are important in a humanitarian context. And the third, the shift of cash from a focus on exclusively needs to one of opportunity. And that means, what about using cash to finance small and medium-sized enterprises or local organizations, particularly in crisis contexts, where you've got large humanitarian organizations operating there that have large numbers of procurement needs or services that they need while operating there. And what's to stop cash from really supporting those local communities, local businesses from actually entering into the humanitarian supply chain as sources of supplies and services for humanitarian organizations, and particularly when we're there for decades. And And then finally, cash is an entry point to wider financial inclusion. And I know we all talk about cash as an important entry point in that regard, but actually the research that we've been doing here suggests that it's not quite there yet. The evidence, we just did a journey mapping exercise of a cash delivery system in Kenya. And the fact that that delivery mechanism, the fact that cash might have given those people access to, greater use of mobile money, mobile wallets, they really didn't care very much about that. They just were interested in the grant itself and what it could, the purchasing power that it gave them at that very moment. But I think there is an opportunity there to use cash to, give access to credit for traders, access to loans for people who want to start businesses, and other financial instruments that people affected by crisis, and again, in protracted situations, really don't have access to right now. So I guess what am I trying to say? That cash transfers, they're continuing to grow in importance and effectiveness. And as Paul was saying, they really are, kind of the advent now of the real digitization of the humanitarian sector. But I think we haven't gone far enough in really using the power of cash to change the way we work, not merely to just make the way we work more efficient and effective as it is now. So I think cash could be further catalyzing that digitization and also the kind of more networked way of working as a sector. It could be supporting the creation of new financial tools, those kind of investment tools that would see ODA as a catalyst for new forms of money in crisis contexts. And it also could be the driving force into a sort of a new power dynamic between those who have and those who need, the relationship between who is funding, who has the funds, and who needs the funds. Cash can really, just be that kind of disruptor that takes the humanitarian system into the next era. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christina. That's really inspiring vision. It is. So, Paula, I suppose I'd like to ask you whether organisations are asking themselves the right questions to make that next generation of cash a reality.
Yeah. So I'm very happy to share with you today a couple of reflections on the work that I've been doing in the last couple of years with agencies. And I'm going to use this term in the broader sense because they're all agencies for me. And that includes the work I've done with NGOs, but also with UN agencies, startups, and other private sector actors. So I'm going to focus on 2 points, and it's about how agencies approach the future for guidance and whether they are willing to make the right choices. So the first thing that I like you to realize is the way that we approach the future matters, right? The way that agencies pose questions about the future is important because the solution is usually baked into the question. So foresight and futures might sound a bit weird, right, to some of you in the room, but it's not a new thing. We've been using forecasting for a really long time. It's just that the questions that we've been asking of the future have to do with the external environment. So we have forecasts around where is the next crisis going to be, and where is the money coming from, and what is and insert technology here, going to disrupt the way we work. And that question reflects a system that is perceived as a pipeline, right? So when you see yourself as a pipeline, you're producing a product that you have to get from point A to point B, and you're trying to produce value in a super linear way. So agencies that work in this way look at cash like this. I produce something, then I track, and then I give it to someone, and then I ask whether they're satisfied with what I've given them. So it's really interesting for me because I've been working in the system of the pipeline for a very long time, even though I've been doing cash programming for 15 years. And what I've been seeing recently happening in the fringe, where all good futures happen, is that there are some agencies that are starting to ask themselves a different question. So the very first time I heard an agency ask, will we be needed? I was like, oh my God, the future is about to arrive. Because they are no longer asking about who's going to fund my change process. They're asking, what will vulnerability look like? And they're asking, will we be trusted? And they're asking, can someone else do a better job? Now, I've asked those questions myself when I've been part of particular NGOs, and I can tell you that people don't like when people ask those questions because it challenges their business model. It challenges their own value proposition. And when people start asking, will we be needed? What it shifts is what you were talking about, Christina, in terms of the relationship between the principal and the agent. So when you think of yourself as able to build your own future, that totally changes the game. So some agencies have realized that for compliance or for donor pressure, they have to ask themselves, will we be needed? We've been talking about like getting ourselves out of a job for ages, no? So the agencies that think that they need to do that, they are very quick to answer yes. And they like patch up their strategy and they use words like, we're going to stay relevant, we're going to make ourselves agile, we're going to reduce exposure. But there are other agencies who are being brave enough to realize that their business model doesn't work anymore. So cash cannot be delivered as a commodity. And I hope I don't have to repeat that again. Cash can only be delivered when we are generating value in the way that a platform generates value. So it's no longer about delivering value to one single person, which is my donor, or to one single person, which is my beneficiary. It's about delivering value in every relationship. So if you're getting in a relationship with like a local private sector, you have to deliver value. You have to deliver value to the government that you work with, to the local NGOs that you work with. So the agencies that are brave enough to like really go through an introspection process like this are like challenging deeply grounded assumptions. So I'm going to give you a couple of tips to identify those agencies so that you can fund them and work for them. Agencies that are brave enough talk about decolonization of aid because they understand that pipelines are obsolete. So they are willing to remove themselves from this relationship of you are poor, I'm going to give you something. Agencies that are asking the right question talk about people. They don't talk about beneficiaries or recipients. They talk about people. And they also think about transferring knowledge or tools. They don't talk about transferring stuff, right? Because if you think about the earthquake in Mexico, people were super rapid to organize themselves. And one of the agencies sitting in this room sent them stuffed toys. Right? So people didn't need money and they didn't need staff. What they needed was your know-how. So when agencies are willing to understand that the game has changed, they talk about sending knowledge, sharing tools, not sending staff or sending stuff. They also talk about user experience. They don't only talk about accountability and preference, right? And I was mentioning in one of the groups today that I am baffled at how we're always saying that we cannot get the accountability beneficiaries right when I am so fulfilled as an Amazon customer. And I've never met an Amazon person in my life. So if Amazon can get it so right, how can we get it so wrong? And finally, there are agencies that question whether their business model is actually being effective in stopping like one of the biggest crises in our lifetime, which is the famine in Yemen. Anyone who's questioning whether their business model is available and able to do that is potentially in the right path. I don't think that there's a lot of agencies that would fit in the category that I'm talking about, but there are a few, and you only need a few to produce a trend in the fringe. So I just want to stop this point saying the questions matter, right? So make sure that you understand what are the questions of the future that the agency that you work for is asking, and also make sure that you know the questions of the future that the agencies that you're funding are asking themselves. And that brings me to my second point, because I am a little bit worried that even though we have all this information about the future and we are producing loads of reports and coming to these panels, that we are not necessarily able to make the right choice. So as you were saying as well, Christina, ultimately everyone right now is in a race to define their competitive advantage. Like cash came out into the mainstream at the World Humanitarian Summit, and ever since everyone's been trying to figure out how to do more of it because there's a lot of money in it, right? So if they don't call it competitive advantage, they might call it mandate, but everyone's trying to figure it out. The problem is that we're like a tourist who's trying to plan a trip to London with a Lonely Planet guide from like 1991, right? Like our decision-making shortcuts of agencies that have massive infrastructure, high overheads, loads of unrestricted funding don't work anymore. Those shortcuts are useless. So when leadership, right, in these agencies gets faced by the prospect of shrinking or even disappearing, well, they get totally into survival mode. And I don't know if you've ever been short of cash, right? But it changes the way that you make decisions. It's actually been scientifically proven that your cognitive ability reduces when you're experiencing high levels of stress. So we have a lot of humanitarian leaders who are approaching decisions about the future with a scarcity mentality. So instead of looking at the future as a portfolio of investment choices, they're looking at it as risks that they have to mitigate. So when you're looking at risks, you're not looking at investing. You're looking at mitigating them. And you're looking at investing on the right now. So you're looking at the land grab, you're looking at the positioning, you're looking at the hardcore competition, because your brain doesn't allow you to think about all of the investments that would actually be smarter and would put you and the people you're trying to serve in a better place. So I think that how to redesign our capacity to see the future and to reactivate it, to lean into the emerging future, is probably the biggest challenge of our humanitarian generation. If we don't manage to get it right, we will be remembered for our inability to make the right choice. So I know that everyone in the room knows that people deserve a better version of aid in the future. I don't think there's disagreement on that. But we don't all need to run around and do cash to have a better version of the future. What we need to do is approach the future from a selfless perspective and then be willing to make the right choice.
Thank you, Paula. So we've heard from Christina about the transformational potential of cash, and we've heard from Paula about the types of organizations that can really shape that transformational future. So Rahul, it'd be great to hear from you some insights on what makes for successful change.
It's a difficult question. So look, imagine it's 1927. You're Alexander Fleming. You've just come up with this wonder drug. It's cheap, it's easy to produce. You can solve infectious disease. Move forward 91 years. You have, on the one hand, 10 million people a year continuing to die because of the lack of availability of this cheap, easy to produce wonder drug that will cure their infectious disease. And on the other hand, you have hundreds of millions of people at risk because of the overuse of this drug. And so they're going to be resistant to this drug, and you're not going to be able to save their lives, so they will also die of infectious disease. It's not an optimistic example, but it's just to say that our levels of confidence in narratives about what the future looks like far exceed our ability to actually understand what that future looks like. I want to sort of raise a couple of points. There are four things I think we get wrong consistently. The first is we overestimate the pace of change, and we underestimate the orders of magnitude. We always think the change is coming fast, and it's going to happen soon, and we're going to be there, and the change is going to look like something that we can manage. And in fact, it's going to take a long time to arrive, and it's not going to look like anything that we understand fully. And we are consistently and pretty universally wrong about that. We're wrong because we have, I think, a human love for dichotomies. You're either the Romans or the Visigoths. And in fact, history tells you that you're not either the Romans or the Visigoths. You might end up being Italian or Portuguese or Belgian or many other things. So we have a pace problem. We have a false dichotomy problem. We misunderstand the oblique nature of change, right? You have this idea that path dependencies get created. Those of us who suffered through political science lectures thought about this a lot, but your perspective on the path dependency depends on where you're standing and how you're looking forward. And in fact, there's a whole lot of stuff moving in all kinds of different directions around you. And suddenly, as I find myself frequently in my life, looking around saying, wait, what's going on? What's been happening? How has this worked? What is Snapchat? You know, will I even know about Snapchat in 5 years? Things come, things go. It depends where you're standing. It's hard to understand. And against all of that, we are constrained by what I would call a Foucauldian love of institutions to perpetuate themselves. You know, institutions want to exist. Humans want to exist. We like to be part of things, and when we think we're part of something, we want that thing to carry on. And so that's where we are now, right? We are overestimating the pace of change. We're putting false dichotomies, cash, not cash. We don't understand all the other things that are changing, and we're saying, but I will endure. And that gives us, I think, a number of roles that if you look back in 10, 15, 20, I don't know what the right number of years is, you will see some humanitarians who will have turned out to be the champions of the right kind of change. Let's call them the winners. You'll see some who will be the enablers of the right kind of change, the sort of puppet masters in the shadows who weren't quite sure enough to commit publicly, but still wanted to be part of it. You'll have the passive bystanders of change, the people who said, well, I don't really understand this, I'm just going to watch and sit this one out. And you will have, let's call them the orange-haired people of change, the climate change deniers of change, the people who said this is not happening, it's not going to happen, we're all going to be fine, and business will continue as usual. And the thing is, we actually don't know which one of those is right or who we are at any given point. And so there's just a tremendous amount of uncertainty that we're faced with, and that requires us to approach it with humility and understanding. The humility part is not what I would call endogenous to the sector. It's not something we come to naturally, and that's a problem. The understanding part is also not necessarily our strongest point. And as we've heard, you know, we have the relationships with private sector institutions, or we're building them. You know, everyone's got a private sector branch, and they're running around doing private sector-y things. We have relationships with public capital. We all have donor relationships. We have relationships with philanthropic capital. Everyone's running around chasing a billionaire. But what we don't have is the individual relationships that Christina and Paula are talking about, the understanding of how the people themselves will transform this system and everything that we do, and how we make that knowledge and their own desires and their vision for what that system is the vector for the transformation that we're trying to support or enable. So the question before us is that a transition is happening. A transition is always happening. And our job is how to manage that transition as effectively as we can, because we serve this higher order goal of bringing a measure of humanity into a situation that should not have existed in the first place. How are we going to do that? You have a choice, evidence or guesswork. I'm not keen on the guesswork approach. I feel like it's problematic. I think the evidence approach has a lot to offer if you approach it with humility. But I think that Paul's point about the ethics actually becomes critical, because the norms are what allow you, in a process of uncontrolled change, to determine and to actually constrain out the futures that are deeply undesirable. We're not going to necessarily build a pathway to heaven. We are not going to solve all the problems of the world. But can we ensure that as we go through this change that is digitalization, or is cash, or is differentiated financial instruments, or radical shifts in the distribution of power around the globe, that we do it in a way that avoids things that we hold to be truly awful ethically? I think we can, if we have the ethics, and if we pay attention to the evidence as much as possible, and if we're sort of deeply and genuinely humble. So I'll say all that, which does not really use the word cash, because the question is actually about financial assistance, and the process of change isn't a process of change driven by the existence of cash. It's driven by transformations in the wider world. Cash is a part and an instrument of that, and we don't even really understand what cash will look like in 20 years. And I mean, how many of you could have dreamed up Bitcoin? Some of you are very young. Those of us who are less than very young could not have conceived of Bitcoin when we were dialing people on rotary telephones, like a digital what? We don't know. It's going to be different. And we have a lot of thinking to do, but please, let's be humble about that thinking. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Rahul. So whatever direction change takes, or we influence it to take, we know that digitization will be at the heart of it. So, Paul, what are some of the opportunities and pitfalls around that?
So I'm really nervous right now for two reasons. The first is that I only really properly prepared for the 1 minute part of this, not the 5 minute part. The second reason I'm a bit nervous is because a lot of my work has been about the future of humanitarianism in one form or another, both when I was working in response and also when now I'm working at a sort of policy and practice level. And I find that I've been out-futured by every single other person on this panel. So that leaves me at a bit of a disadvantage. So what I'd like to do then is actually look at what's happened and how we got here rather than start with where we're going. Even though Rahul doesn't necessarily agree with path dependency, it's important to look back at where we've come from. But I'm only going to do that very briefly because I think the broad sketch is, you might have heard about 10 years ago there was a financial crisis that really had a large negative impact on the global economy. Anyone not hear about that? Okay, good. Everyone heard that. There's another one next year, by the way. So if you didn't get that first one, it's coming again. Now, what happened after that was twofold. One is there's been a huge burst of innovation in financial services, the financial technology or fintech revolution. And the company that I work for is part of that. So a huge amount of innovation. And a lot of that has been around providing services in financial assistance, providing services in the sort of things that are related to cash. But at the same time, we're also living with the legacy of the institutions that caused and facilitated the financial crisis in the first place. So all of us still use banks. All of us still use foreign exchange institutions. All of us still have to rely on that old infrastructure. But at the same time, we are being threatened by this new infrastructure, these new financial service providers that might actually be doing a better job of getting cash to us than we are. And you can see this in things like the rise of mobile money, where you have mobile network operators who are better at distributing cash than we appear to be. But those two different trends, the legacy and the innovation, both have something in common. And it's what's been called the war on cash. Because when we talk about cash, instantly most of us think of cash. And you've had this discussion, I know, this week, so I'm not going to repeat it. The notes and the coins in the pocket. But of course, most cash is not that, and most of the cash that we deal with is not that. And in the future, almost none of the cash that we deal with is going to be that type of cash. And so the war on cash refers to the idea that all of these institutions and the governments that frame them and regulate them have an interest in eliminating cash. The hard cash, the easy cash, the cash that is difficult to trace, the cash that can be used for anything you want, rather than anything that is permitted. And so part of the reason that I worry about the future of financial assistance is because all finance is going to move digital. It's going to be hard to stop it because it's more efficient for the providers, it's more convenient for the users, and most importantly, you can monetize it. Now, before you couldn't monetize cash. The pound coins in my pocket, nobody can really make any money off that except the person I give it to. But when I pay with my Oyster card, there's data. When I pay with contactless, there's data. When I pay with anything other than hard cash, there's data, and somebody can monetize that data. And that is what is driving the digitization of cash. That is what is driving digitization more broadly. The venture capitalist Mark Andreessen once wrote an article which is very well known, in which he basically posited that software will eat the world. That essentially software, all companies will become software companies. All institutions will become software institutions. Now, it doesn't mean they won't do other things. An industrial manufacturer will still manufacture things, but really it's the software that makes the manufacturing and not the other way around. And particularly when it's something like finance, which can be dematerialized, you can see how software will eat that particular sector. And I think we've alluded to this already, that is happening now to the humanitarian sector. Cash is just the first part of the wave. I'm very interested and very potentially optimistic about what the digitization of humanitarian assistance might bring, both in terms of making the current delivery better, but also in terms of different types of delivery, the sort of approaches that both Christina and Paula have outlined. You know, there's a huge opportunity here. However, we might not be the best institutions to take advantage of that opportunity. In the world in which software is eating everything, the disruptive organizations, the companies that tend to take the advantage, are the ones who are digital first to begin with. Those are the ones that come out of nowhere and suddenly grab a huge market share from institutions that didn't realize they were coming. So Paula mentioned Amazon. Amazon's a software company. Sure, it delivers stuff. It doesn't make any of that stuff. What it does is it delivers things. It's really, really good at delivering things and fulfilling your requirements in that sense. But what it's done is eat a huge portion of the market share of retail, to the extent that Amazon and the transformation of retail hollows out high streets. It changes our relationship with retail functions, with how we shop and how we relate to shopping. And that in turn has a secondary impact on the culture more broadly, because believe it or not, a lot of our culture was oriented around shopping and commerce, essentially. So digital first. What would happen, what will happen, what is happening is that digital first organizations are entering the humanitarian space. And some of them are doing delivery, some of them are doing coordination, some of them are doing other functions. But they're digital first in a way that makes us, and when I say us, I talk about the traditional humanitarian sector, which is where I come out of, it makes us look lumbering, it makes us look out of date, it makes us look almost obsolete. And so we struggle. We struggle to digitize. Cash is a way we think we can move forward, but there's a broader question about how we implement these sorts of digital efficiencies and capabilities within our organizations. And maybe we'll be able to do it and maybe we won't. Maybe we will do ourselves out of a job. Maybe that transformation will hit everybody. I think it will, unless we manage to embrace this new way of working. But this new way is not just about digitization. It's not just about getting computers into everything. It's not just about being software. It's about new ways of working. And the paper that I wrote for ODI, for Christina earlier this year, was called Network Humanitarianism, and it outlined sort of 5 strategies that you could adopt if you wanted to embrace this networked way of working. My belief is that if we don't, then we won't survive. We will be outcompeted. My worry is that if we don't survive, then humanitarian principles might not survive, because we guard those principles too closely, and they're not as broadly shared, I think, as they should be. And so, as Christina outlined, this question of delivery through the network is a key part of what we're doing. And the problem, as I sort of alluded to in my 1-minute spiel, which I will now go back to, safe ground again, is that in the network there are a whole host of unrecognized and possibly unrecognizable risks. So there are risks that we see at the moment, and we all know now, in the wake of GDPR, in the wake of various data breaches from Facebook and other large companies, that there are clear risks around sharing our data with companies when we don't have any real understanding of what they're doing with it, and we don't have any really control over what they do with it further. But there are a whole host of other potential risks that we don't even really understand in terms of the second order impacts of what that dataification of life might have on our societies. We're starting to. I think everyone now in this room, I guess, is probably as nervous as I've always been about the way in which technology reshapes our society. And technology will reshape the humanitarian sector. The network will reshape the humanitarian sector. And the worry that we all should have, the thing that should be foremost in our minds, is that I don't mind if I lose my job. I don't mind if my organization goes out of business. I'll probably survive. I'm in a privileged position. I'm in a privileged position financially, socially, politically. Politically, that might change next year, Brexit. Let's not think about that right now. But the people that we work with, the most vulnerable people, people who've lost the protection of their state, the people that have lost their businesses, their livelihoods, they do not have the affordances that I have, that we have, when it comes to protecting ourselves. They do not live, for example, in EU countries which are now covered by the GDPR. So I earlier this year was doing research in Lebanon, Jordan, and Uganda on digital identity for refugees. You don't even want to know about it. It's not good. But none of those countries have effective data protection legislation. Lebanon and Jordan don't have any data protection legislation. Uganda is moving towards having effective. So all the things that we take into account here as being, safeguarding us don't exist And yet we are going into those countries without really thinking about what our positioning is with regards to those sorts of impacts and the second order impacts we might have. So I'll wrap it up there. I wish I had something optimistic to say. Maybe Brexit won't happen. There you go. I just revealed my politics there, I guess, but that's fine. But I do think that there is a tremendous opportunity. There's a tremendous opportunity for the humanitarian community more broadly to take a different type of approach to the work that we do, to think about what it means to work in the network, to think about what it means to be digital first, and particularly to think about, from the perspective of the people that we are working for and that we are working with, what does a well-designed system look like for them? A well-designed digital system look like for them? What if we embed privacy by design at the heart of all the systems we do, and we don't just buy off the shelf from whatever commercial company, makes the best offer? Now, that might cost more, it might take longer, but in the longer run, that's the approach that we need to have if we don't want to suffer the same sort of reputational attacks that Facebook has had with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, for example. So there is an opportunity. We have to grasp it. We don't have any choice, but we have to really be fully aware of what we're walking into and be prepared to invest in how we actually approach those problems.
Thanks so much, Paul, and for your wise words of caution, which I think we should all take note of. I'm sure, I hope anyway, that many of you have lots of questions for our panelists. But just before we open up the floor, I just wanted to reflect a little bit more on Paul's comment there regarding humanitarian principles and what the implications of these potential future scenarios for financial assistance in our emerging roles might be for humanitarian principles. And I don't need reflections from all the panelists on this, but I'm going to start with Christina, and then if anybody else would like to add, that would be very welcome.
Sure. Humanitarian principles. So for me, I guess I have two problems with humanitarian principles as they're currently conceived of, or as they're currently implemented now. Number one, I talked in my 5-minute spiel about the exceptionalism that we operate within as humanitarians because we have the principles, because the principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence somehow make us different, exceptional from our development counterparts, from the private sector, from our peace-building counterparts, from political actors, because they are sort of enshrined in everything. They are embedded in everything that we do. I have two problems with it. Number one, because show me an organization that actually is able to implement those principles in the way that they're currently formulated. I think we all hold them dear as foundations for our work, as operational guidelines for the way we should be working, as aspirations for the way that we deliver the assistance that we're trying to deliver. But even the most principled of organizations, or those organizations that really advocate and sort of build on principles as their organizational identity, will in private tell you the trade-offs that they go through every day in trying to implement those principles to the letter. So it is almost hypocritical of us to be saying that we as organizations can be principled and others cannot be. And so others that aren't as principled as we are therefore not legitimate forms of assistance, or aren't actors or people or institutions that we can work with as peers. So I think we sort of discard a whole community, a whole constellation of organizations and individuals because they aren't principled humanitarian actors, but actually within the societies in which they work, they are much more legitimate than we will ever be. So in terms of digitalization and, the new types of institutions, the digital first institutions, the way that we use data, it will affect our principles, but I think in holding them so close and not making sure that we continue to promote them as underpinning the way that we work, without discarding or without kind of rejecting those who don't abide by them. We are cutting off our nose to spite our face. I think they should remain operational guidelines. They should remain at the foundation of what we do, but I don't think they should be what decides who we work with and who we don't.
Thanks. Any other reflections?
I'll give it a go. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to pick on something you said only because you picked on Amazon that I love so much. No, I'm joking. I knew I was going to get in trouble. So you said if your worry is that if we don't survive, then humanitarian principles won't survive. And I think that's one of the biggest I don't want to say lies, so I'm going to say assumptions of our current times. And I've worked this year in particular with a lot of non-traditional humanitarians who are so much interested and invested in making sure that they don't produce something that is going to harm people in a way that I haven't seen a lot of agencies. Even those who have been legally tasked with protecting the humanitarian principles. So we are constantly, as humanitarians, talking about putting people at the center and accountability to beneficiaries, but we struggle so much because we're in a principal-agent relationship with people who don't necessarily incentivize us to do that. Now, when you're producing something for someone, which is like ultimately your customer, it's the center of your universe. So people use personas, they use like user-centered design, they use user experience to design a product that is going to be useful for that person. So I don't necessarily think that profit is in competition or fighting with humanitarian principles. I think if we were smarter as humanitarians, we would find a way of making sure that those principles get embedded in the standards that other actors care about. So I recently participated in a conference about ISO standards and the SDGs. Those are proper standards that are enforceable and that companies that have budgets that are 50 million bigger than our budgets care about. So if we are really looking at a future of doing things better for people, we need to find a way of embedding those principles that we care about into what those actors care about. That will never get me another consultancy with a humanitarian NGO.
On the contrary, Paula. Yeah.
Go first.
Yeah, you can go last.
Oh, everyone wants to.
So I disagree. I share a lot of Paula's sort of views, particularly the view that we need to embed humanitarian principles in the wider culture, the wider society, in the organisations that we work with. We need to be more effective at doing that. But I don't think it's a lie or an assumption that if we disappear, humanitarian principles might disappear, because there is no one else fighting for them. Maybe we don't observe them. Maybe we're not very good at them. Maybe frequently, we overpromise and underdeliver. Who knows? Maybe that's true. But frankly, there's no one else out there. The danger, of course, is that if we treat people who are in need as customers, it's essentially, that's basically late-stage capitalism, just eating our cake. Now, some people are happy with that. I'm not. I dream of a better world than that. I dream of a world in which people are not treated merely as cogs in a capitalist machine. I'm aware that sort of puts me at a disadvantage. And I'm not accusing anybody, I'm not accusing Paula of arguing that. But that's the danger. The danger of being digital first is that, and adopting certain technologies in particular, is the technologies come embedded with values. The sort of so social media has a set of values embedded in it, which are invisible to most people because you don't think about it that much, but the values are there. And the values shape the way that the users interact with it in a way that they're usually not very conscious of. Amazon, and there are second-order things. I'm not a fan of Amazon. I think it's a pernicious influence on commerce. I think it's tax dodging and generally destructive influence that masquerades as being convenient for consumers. That's. But these are different perspectives that need to be discussed, right? And we need to have these perspectives, all of these perspectives within the sector. We need to negotiate between these perspectives in the sector. We need to find our way to our own perspective in the sector, not just to accept my personal antipathy towards a certain way of doing things. We need to find our own way of doing things, rather than inheriting those sorts of values along with the technology and the business models that come out of commerce. So I think that there's the opportunities I talked about are opportunities to reshape our business model. But it has to be our business model. We can't just take it off the shelf from another sector and say, hey, this works, they're doing really good stuff. We have to shape it. We have to shape it in accordance with the values that we believe in, that we hold to.
So I'll be brief so we can get to questions. The false reification of the humanitarian principles in 46.182 in particular precludes us from developing the kind of ethical constraints that would allow us to build a better digital future, because we rely on something that's neither applicable nor particularly relevant to the world in which we will live. So yeah, relitigate, reopen. I guess I'm not joining MSF next week.
So I'm hearing a call from our panelists to not shop with Amazon, but also crucially maybe define what the collective values are that will shape our future, and particularly shape the future of financial assistance. So maybe that's something we can bring into the questions. So yeah, over to you. We'll take rounds of 3 questions. Yeah. Jessica? And yes, so there's some CaLP colleagues going around the room with some microphones.
Okay, I was not. It's okay? Okay, great. So my first question, I have a few reflections and a few questions as well. I'm Francesca from Save the Children UK. What I heard, and it was a fascinating panel, really. I was a cash advisor for a few years, and I think that this was the most fascinating set of speeches that I've heard. And the reason is that I heard you talking about ethics in the work that we do, and ethics has been sort of forgotten. We focus a lot on the technical and operational aspects of our work, but we've actually forgotten about the ethics and why we do that. In the Agenda for Humanity that has shaped the World Humanitarian Summit, one of the key principles was that we are here to end need. So when I hear that agencies are actually asking Paula and others, I believe, are we going to be needed? Well, actually, we shouldn't want to be needed. We should want that the need ends. And how to make that end end, actually, that's the question. So there are incentives that are actually created by our donors. And these incentives are actually generating a perverse effect in the way we operate. My question to the panel is, how do you think the donors should change the incentives that they create in the way humanitarian work operates, in a way that we actually are not clinging to our mandates? We are here to end the needs, and we're here to be flexible and to provide what is actually demanded by the population we serve. Thank you.
So thanks, Francesca. Jake?
Hi, I'm Jake Zarens from Habitat for Humanity and Shelter Cluster. I'm not very good at future stuff, and you said lots of very, very clever things, that some of which went way over my head and some of which resonated and some I disagreed with. But one point that Paula made, I think, spoke to the future, the present and the past, and you mentioned knowledge and the value of knowledge. And so I guess sort of something I'd like to put to you is the provision of knowledge, the contextualization of knowledge is something that does give humanitarians a lot of value in solving problems immediately after a disaster or following a crisis. Yet every organization I work for, the knowledge, the technical departments are seen as a luxury. They're always the first to get cut when times are hard, and they're always the last to be filled up when times are good. Many of our larger UN colleagues, their technical departments are funded or provided purely by secondments. They don't resource those departments. So how can we as a community give real value to that knowledge base, build on that knowledge base, which in turn can then facilitate the usage of financial assistance to really meet end game objectives, solve causational issues? How can we really big that bit up as the thing that we do and the thing that we should be doing more of?
So it's Karen from CaLP, and mine builds nicely on the 2 former points. And really, I mean, I think you've just sort of outlined, the pathologies that are against change, the kind of the colonialism of aid. The question then is, what are the incentives? What do we have to change? I don't think it's just about donors. I think it's more than that. I don't think it's just about knowledge. What is it? What are those things that we can do that will actually allow it to happen? Or is it just going to wait and happen to us?
Who's the we, sorry.
Thank you. So I think those questions are actually very interlinked. So I'd suggest that the panelists take them together. And I'm going to pick on you, Paula, to start myself, please.
I think you're right. The question of ethics never comes up because no one pays for it, right? So the incentives, I think the incentives would need to start from the donors having like a very honest look at what is the behavior that they're trying to provoke on the agents, as in like the agencies that they're funding. Because sometimes I think that they think that they're going to produce a certain behavior with their incentive, which is the funding, that causes the complete opposite. So when we were sitting at the World Humanitarian Summit and we were reading a paper that said cash is the future, which I'm guessing was supported by like donors who were funding the conference, I don't think anyone thought that it was going to be like the reenactment of like, I don't know, the foundation of the city of Ohio, which was basically like someone calling people to stand at the border, and then at noon everyone could run and put stakes, and whatever land they managed was going to be theirs. So I think having like a really good understanding of what is the behavior that they want to produce would be great. But we also have to recognize that those institutional funders are governments, and governments have a political agenda that they usually use their funds to achieve. So I think to go back to the question of ethics, we probably need to get better at getting our own funding if we want to be able to concentrate on ethics. To your question, Jake, about like giving real value to knowledge, I think it's a massive struggle, right? But I think it comes from the business model that we're in. So imagine the extreme example of a pipeline, which is a factory. You're trying to do things as cheaply as you can so that your margins are as big as you can. You're trying to do it as quickly as you can, and you're trying to do it in the best possible way in that pipeline. So when you're a pipeline, you invest in logistics, right? You invest in massive planes. You invest in infrastructure. That I haven't said knowledge, right? Because the knowledge that you have is basically proprietary information on how you're going to build that product. Now, if you look at how you generate value in a platform sort of environment, you have to generate value not like this and as quickly as you can, but to so many people that then like knowledge in itself becomes valuable because you have to know all these different people. So I think it will eventually happen. And to those who don't realize that cash has disrupted like their business model, it will just happen to them without them knowing. And then to like finish with your question, Karen, I think it will happen to most people. Like one day they will wake up and they'll be like, what, Diffit, you're not funding us anymore and you're funding this P2P startup from like what? I'm hoping it will not be to the majority that it happens, but I'm hoping that it will happen to a large enough number because this sector is already quite obese.
Who would like to go next? Rahul?
Sure. What can the sector do? I think it actually starts with the very boring stuff. What are the trajectories of the instruments and the way things are changing right now? What do we know that we know? What is the framework in which that operates? How do the SDGs and other things tell us about what we're supposed to be doing and how it's supposed to work? And what options does that give us? At some point, you need to put the stuff on the table in a rational manner, and that has not happened yet. There's sort of very few dispassionate looks at what things are, and more people running around to build the city of Columbus, Ohio. Is it? Fantastic. I know people who live there, so I'm going to have to make fun of them. How do we value knowledge, and how do we sort of understand the amount of attention that should be given to the technically skilled portions of the humanitarian sector? Part of that is understanding what their role is, right? In a world where you can operate without that technical capacity on hand, you have no incentive. In a future where you have modular technical capacities run by a single unified back office, because really does every organization need a back office and the £7 or dollar differentiation salaries that mark you as World Vision, Oxfam or Save the Children? Is that a rational allocation of resources? Don't know. So that stuff will change. It will change because we will be led by reality. It's not going to change right now because there's no incentive for it to change. The thing that I took away, Francesca, from your question was actually that humanitarians really need to spend more time in development jobs, because there's sort of this short-termist time frame to humanitarian thinking that fails to incorporate, I would say, the sad reality that we're never going to end need. We're not going to win, we're not going to succeed, but we're going to mitigate and improve and try to shift and nudge trajectories a little bit. And I don't know if it's for better or worse, but when you spend time in development, you start to become happy with those nudges, because I think it's a tremendous amount of value that you can place by shifting the trajectory. Getting a child back into education inside of 3 months has a massive long-term effect on their life and on their community and city, country, region. So, there's sort of incentives problem, but I think that we are approaching a point where the distinction, I'm definitely not working for MSF now, between humanitarian and development has collapsed in on itself, as it should. I have never in my years, either in headquarters or the field, had anybody who was the victim of anything actually come up to me and say, what I really need right now is some humanitarian principled assistance. Don't give me development, and I definitely don't want peacekeeping or any of that peace and security. Just some principled humanitarian assistance would be great.
All right. I'm going to agree with Rahul on something that he said. I'm going to start with this ending need comment, because I'm going to agree with you on that, although it will contradict what you have just said on humanitarian versus development. But I actually think that the ethical way forward for humanitarians is to accept the fact that it is not our job to end need. I thought that was a huge mistake on the part of the Secretary General, including that in the agenda for humanity. If we are to have any humility, if we are to have any ethical basis for the work that we do not set out to end need. That is societal transformation. That is things that communities and people should be doing for themselves. We, as you were saying, we can nudge them on the path of being able to do that. But I think starting out with ending need as a first principle of humanitarian action is the wrong way to go. But within what we can do about it, to Karen's point about incentives, I think it starts, we all talk about donors incentivizing us to do things in a certain way, and I think that plays an important part. But I do think that the first step on changing the incentives is changing our mindsets, and that is really about the way that we approach our jobs. We should not be approaching our jobs as saviors, but really as surrogates. We are temporary replacements for services in a situation where domestic services have broken down. And that is all that we are meant to be doing. And we should be there as surrogates, as replacements when we need to be replacements, and then as enablers of those services to be put back into place when they can be. Before money, I think we need to shift the way that we think about our work. And then in terms of change and how change happens and how all that mindset shift needs to happen, Paul Knox-Clark from ALNAP has written a really interesting paper on change during the past year. And he kind of puts together this metaphor of a football match, a soccer game, in my language, whereby, the humanitarian system is a complex adaptive system. And what that means is that a complex adaptive system will always try to get back to equilibrium. If it's disrupted, it's always going to find a way to regain the equilibrium, the steady state that it had before. So to use the football match analogy, if you have a single player that runs out of the pack and starts to shift the game, to try to change the game, that tries to shift the action to a different part of the pitch, you will have the rest of those players kind of adapting and moving around to follow that player and restart the game in another way on a different part of the pitch, because that is also a complex adaptive system. So that we will be looking for people who are going to be the disruptors, who are going to be the ones running out in front of the pack, because the system itself will have to adapt and change around them if there are enough of them out there, or if the change is significant enough. And then maybe to the point about knowledge and technical knowledge in particular, I actually think that that is our competitive advantage. I think with all this talk about localization and all of these different actors coming into the humanitarian space and digital first and all that, what do we have to give? We actually have 100 years of practice and best practice and technical knowledge that could really be put to good use for people that are trying out new and different things or who need on the spot technical assistance when they need it. So I think if we were to do one thing to really regain our competitive advantage vis-a-vis the rest of the world in humanitarian response, we should really be funding our the redevelopment of our field craft, of that technical expertise that we do so well, and that actually that is the one thing that we can add to a national response or a locally led response, where you've got lots of different people that maybe know a lot about the local context, but maybe not so much about that water system, or maybe not so much about what is necessary for an Ebola response. So I think investing in that type of technical capacity is the way forward.
There's a coaching vacancy at Man U about to open up. Well, there should be.
Very motivational. Paul, yeah? Okay. We've got about sort of just under 10 minutes. I think we can have at least a couple more questions. Yeah. So William, and then Dom and Naomi.
I'm William from CRS, Catholic Relief Services. And yeah, it's interesting. It's really resonated a lot. The panel is really high quality. Thank you very much for that. So it's interesting because we see with like the digitization, the automation of humanitarian response, what we see is the power is changing hands, but in the same hemisphere. Like from donor, it goes to investors now, or it changed like countries in the same hemispheres. We see China rising or other countries, right? And my question for you is, do you see an opportunity for this change of power dynamic because of the technology and this like revolution we have now to go toward the south, like these countries that don't have the power yet, or not necessarily the investor, or I don't know. Do you see opportunities there or not? Perhaps in the knowledge transfer you mentioned, or what are the opportunities there? Because it's a very Western question we have here in this room in London, and I was wondering about that.
I'm afraid I missed that Catherine's had her hand up for a little while before, so.
I can speak up. I think just in connection with your question.
Excuse me, because it's recorded, yeah.
Thank you so much, Catherine from World Vision. In connection to your question, and thank you again for this very insightful panel with all the comments. One of the issues I think we're really talking around in a circle is it's about us and how we can ensure that we're future-proof as humanitarian organizations or actors. And basically with this, we're projecting again our own self and our own idealistic way of maybe safeguarding humanitarian principles in a better way, hopefully. But I'm asking myself, what about those people we're supposed to serve and the reason why we're actually there right now, or we think we're there? The question I have is, if we're saying there is a power shift, I actually do not really believe that there is a power shift. It is other stakeholders that have been having power or shifting power among themselves. But if you're looking at the most disaster-affected, most remote areas with the most vulnerable people, and we're talking about blockchain or other things that are very hype right now, we see these people do not have the digital literacy in most cases to even understand what happens to their data. They may perceive that their data actually is being used in a good way, and in the end, no one cares who's about surviving or just trying to get to the next day. What happens to their data if they receive assistance for that? So my question is, what do you think is the future of cash projecting the empowerment of those that are actually affected? What paradigm shifts do we need for those to be empowered and take power into their hands? Thank you.
Thank you. And I think the third question was then, I think it was Dom who had his hand up first.
Hi, Dominic Courage from Save the Children. One of the things, I think it was Rahul that said that we will tend to overestimate the pace of change and underestimate the scale of change. That got me thinking about the level of resistance that we might experience in this process of change, and I think everyone in the room is probably, unwillingly part of that in terms of the but perhaps resistance on the basis of self-preservation, or resistance on the basis of inability to change, or maybe even resistance on the basis of ethics. But my question is, given that we are such an interrelated and interdependent system, how do you interpret the effect that resistance will have on the type of change that we eventually have?
I think, I mean, it's 7:30. I think we can take. How do people feel in general? Okay, we'll take. Well, there was already one at the back before you, then Maria. I'm afraid. Sorry. Take one final one.
I mean, mine's very quick. It actually leads on from Catherine's question, which is so one of the reasons that cash can be so useful. Sorry, I'm Naomi from Charlie Goldsmith Associates. Is the way that it enables those who are receiving financial assistance. It enables them to make their own decisions. And so I'm wondering, given the digitalization of this financial assistance, how is there a way that we can include people who are receiving the financial assistance in shaping the programming of that financial assistance? And are there challenges there? If that, and if there are, what are they, and how do we address them?
Thank you. So I think there are two quite interrelated questions, Catherine's and Naomi's there, on empowerment and how to support people to influence the future of financial assistance. So perhaps, Paul, you could start with those.
Yeah, power. It's always about power in the end. Even the ethics question is about power when you get down to it. So I think technology does, my belief is that technology amplifies capability. So human capability is amplified by the technology that we use. It gives us more opportunity to use it. It gives us more, can't think of the word now. Just going to repeat capability again. And that's good, right? You can give people an additional set of options or ability to realize their desires. The problem with that is that if you've already started, if an individual or institution is already starting out with a high level of power, that's the power that gets amplified. If they're starting out with a relatively small amount of power, that's the power that gets amplified. So in terms of what the network can do, and I prefer talking about networked technology rather than just technology, because I think it captures what we're really talking about. I do think networked technology does provide new opportunities that weren't there before. And the paper that I wrote actually describes some of those. So it gives particular examples in the global south of communities that are actually using that technology for their own purposes and doing things differently than the traditional humanitarian organizations would. But fundamentally, power is never going to be evenly spread. That's not how power functions. We can go back to Foucault again. Regardless of how you look at power, regardless of your theory of power, power is never evenly spread. And so we're always going to run up against that. We're going to run up against it at an operational level within a project. We're going to run up against it at the global level. There was a report today in the Guardian. There's an unreleased report that's going to come out, which shows that internet access has slowed down. So the growth of internet access, which was predicted to continue to exponentially increase, has in fact slowed down. And where has it slowed down? It's slowed down amongst the sort of countries which we consider the most fragile. The ones where the infrastructure is very hard to put up and very hard to maintain, where the governance is not in place to actually make the best of that technology. So now we start to see that. And I think it's very timely of that. I hope that report comes out soon. It's not been released yet. But I think that's a very timely reminder that in this world, sort of that access to the network is part of that power dynamic. And in terms of what we can do, we can decide. We can work out. I think when I talk about, when I say that I'm worried about the survival of, that if our organizations won't survive, then humanitarian principles won't survive. What I'm not saying is I want our organizations to survive. What I'm saying is we need to work out the best way to make sure those principles survive and are enacted, regardless of whether you think, regardless of whether they stay the same, regardless of whether we sort of evolve towards a new set of perhaps more appropriate humanitarian principles, a more, not realistic, but more pragmatic set of humanitarian principles. working out how they survive in a world that's undergoing a lot of disruption, a world where power is being redistributed beneath us from those rich countries, more evenly spread towards new poles such as China or India or other rising economies. I don't have any of these solutions. I don't think anyone on this panel would claim to have these solutions. It is a process that we have to go through, and it starts with asking those questions and recognizing exactly that power is part of it.
Thanks. Does anybody want to pick up on that theme of power and also on William's question, which is more about the systemic level?
Yeah. Just very quickly, because if you look at 20 years in dinosaur time, it's nothing, right? If you look at 20 years in human time, it's substantial. If you look at 20 years in tech time, it's quite a lot of time. And this question about the power shifting to the south, it touches me personally, because that's where I'm from, right? If you think about Central America 20 years ago, there was very little access for marginalized groups to be part of the global economy. Whether that's desirable or not is not something we're going to discuss here today. But it's true that it increases their well-being, right? We all agree on that. So 20 years ago, they were not able to link up with that. They were not able to link up with production methods. They were not able to link up with even sharing of news, right? 20 years later, they can. So I don't like to talk about empowerment, because that means that the people where I'm from have no power, and then you have to give it to them. So I don't think people need to be empowered. I think people need to be included. And if we are able as humanitarian agencies to include them in the things that matter, not by giving them $100 and training them how to be a tailor, give them 1,000 and teach them how to produce software. Really include them in what's made our society successful, we will stop having these conversations about empowering and shifting.
Thanks, Paula. Rahul or Christina, anything to add, perhaps on Dom's question around resistance to change?
I'll let you do that one.
Sure, resistance is futile. I'll tackle, it is futile. You will get steam, the change will happen, and we can sort of, you can constrain negative futures sometimes, in the sense that peacekeeping is an instrument that prevents massive bloodletting. So we have instruments that can prevent really bad things from happening if we incorporate ethics into the design of the technology and our foundational principles of operation. We stand a chance of preventing some terrible futures. It's not a huge chance. You've hit, Paul, on the thing that worries me the most, which is the opportunity cost of our fetishization of all things bright and shiny and digital is systematic underinvestment in the people who are the most vulnerable, and leaving behind and facilitating deeper exclusion of people who are already excluded, in the way that mobile technology has a massive and deeply problematic gender effect. That is more pronounced in areas that we're seeing increased fragility and vulnerability. And so we're all pushing this bright and shiny stuff, and there's a little part of me that is just can we do maternal child bonding and sort of basic public health and early education and emergencies stuff, and maybe use technology to ensure that reaches women and girls who, by a factor of 3 to 1 are systematically excluded from education when things go wrong, which we all know, but we're not focusing on. So I really worry that what we're doing as we go digital is perpetuating that divide and promulgating new technologies that allow us to, as you say, amplify existing instruments of power, because they're self-amplifying in a Foucaultian way. On the cash question, there's these interesting things about the Give Directly RCTs, right? You have to give at a certain level in order for the cash to have a substantial enough impact. So are we willing to make substantial impact in fewer people's lives, but have that impact be sustained, versus sort of basic impact, but not really very good impact in more people's lives? That is the hard trade-off we're facing in a resource-constrained environment. Which is preferable? how? What is the ethical basis for making that decision? Who makes that decision? How is that decision made and translated into organizations? I think that's a set of choices that has always been there, and it's actually all of these new technologies and new innovations and new ideas are bringing that set of choices to light. And I think that's a good thing, but I think it's a horrible, horrible choice, and I wish we didn't have to make it.
So I'm not going to add to anything that everyone's just said, but also just to say that these are questions that we are thinking about here at HPG, and in particular this question about tech and network technology in particular, and the promise that network technology is going to be leveling the playing field, is going to be much more inclusive of marginalized groups, is going to allow us to cover more, to be more impartial in humanitarian assistance than the ways of working that we are involved in now. And so actually, starting next year, we're going to be doing a 2-year research project on technology and inclusivity, and whether they have a positive or a negative relationship with one another. So watch this space, because we have some of these same questions ourselves, and we're going to be trying to help everyone answer them. So pitch, just my pitch.
Fantastic. That's an excellent pitch to end on. Music to our ears. So just to wrap up, I mean, I feel that our panelists tonight have really challenged us to create a new future for financial assistance, a future that's built on humility, that's focused on inclusion, not empowerment, and crucially, that's built on a new set of shared values. And I think that's a really inspiring, but also incredibly challenging ask. And yeah, I look forward to taking that forwards, to CaLP collaborating perhaps with ODI and some of this visioning work, and to continue the discussion with you all. So huge thanks to all the panelists, and to the staff at ODI who've made this event possible. They've done a fantastic job. It's much appreciated. Thank you.